Good morning, my fellow Canadians. Firearms, firearms, facts and fantasies, lies and myths. I have a vested interest in this. I own firearms. I'm a shooter, a hunter. Don't shoot as much as I used to, but I've been involved in firearms and shooting sports for well over 50 years now. I won't go into my qualifications. What I'd like to bring to the table here is logic and fact. I try to think of myself as a reasonably logical person, and even though I might feel strongly about something, I try to keep emotion out of it, try to look at the logic of a thing. So when I see disinformation, misinformation, lies, skewed data, it really angers me because it paints an extremely false picture. Most anti firearms groups, individuals, are dealing with bad information or no information. It's a visceral thing with them. There's no logic to this, no reason to this. Some of what I'm going to bring up is going to make liberals' heads explode, and anti firearms people are just going to go ballistic. But again, fact versus feeling, fact versus fantasy. I am distressed at the deterioration of the fifth estate, of the newspapers, of the media. I'm seeing a narrative put forward, liberal propelled narrative, that bears no relation to the truth and to fact. Fact one, an armed society is a free society. And all we have to do, even today, is look at Venezuela. They are shooting their own citizens in the street. This is after the government made individual firearm ownership illegal and forced the population to hand in their firearms. Then they could impose a totalitarian state. It was done by Hitler, it was done by Mao, it was done by the Ayatollahs in Iran, it was done by Stalin. A disarmed population is a helpless population. Do I agree with legislation regarding responsible ownership of firearms? Absolutely. When I grew up, going back to my old days, we were almost all children of veterans, veterans who knew firearm safety and handling, hunting, shooting. Do you know that a lot of high schools, Western Collegiate, for instance, a lot of high schools, Western Tech, have had 22 caliber shooting ranges in their basements? A lot of people aren't aware of this. This was very common in high schools to have shooting ranges in the basement because there was a cadet military army cadet program on in the school, and this is where they would shoot 22 caliber rifles. How many people know that today? When I was young, you could walk into a sporting goods store, any adult could walk into a sporting goods store and buy a long gun, a shotgun, a rifle, no paperwork required. The fact that we now have a licensing requirement and you have to do a course, I agree with that. I really do. I think that people should be vetted now because that generation, my generation of the children of veterans, they're gone. We are getting new people who do not have that contact with our military past and indeed in many cases are unaware of exactly how active and how important Canada was in the Second World War and First World War and Korean War. Our military history, again, has been degraded by the Liberals and downplayed by the Liberals, and we are by nature a much more modest nation than our southern neighbors. So, fact one I would like to bring out, bearing in mind that even though I own firearms, I do try to keep my own personal feelings out of this and just deal with the logic of the thing. I came across something very recently that absolutely stunned me. And I'm fairly knowledgeable about firearms. I read the pro, the contra, I listen to the antis. The CDC in Atlanta, Center for Disease Control, they keep statistics on many things that have nothing to do with diseases. They to do their demographic models, and they track sociological changes within society. They track many, many, many different factors because they probably will impact at some point outbreaks of disease, and they want to know what they're dealing with. They undertook a study regarding the civilian legal use of firearms in defensive measures. This is not the criminal use of firearms in crime. These are the legal use of firearms by legally registered owners legally possessing or carrying firearms. They undertook a study to illustrate the preponderance of legal versus illegal use of firearms. Okay, civilian use of firearms in, let's say, defensive situations or preventing crime. They sat on that report for 3 years. Now, I give them full credit for this, doing what was right. They approached this from the standpoint that less guns equals less crime. And therefore, that they were approaching the stance from a position of putting forward a proposal to limit firearms ownership. They were stunned at the results of their study. They sat on it for 3 years, I assume, trying to see if the numbers would change and if the statistical models would change. And when they didn't, they finally released the report. What they discovered, and this is something we don't hear about in Canada and even in the US, the media keeps very quiet about this. The legal use of a firearm as a crime preventative measure far outstrips what we are told. So to put it simply, in states or municipalities or areas where there was relaxed criteria for a law-abiding, vetted citizen to own a firearm and carry a firearm, concealed carry or open carry. In these areas, crime, firearm crime particularly, murders by guns, were vastly reduced compared to the national models. Get it? Think about that. In an area where you are allowed, a good citizen is allowed to be armed, the murder rate was very, very low. This made sense to me because it's the theory of MAD, mutually assured destruction. If you are a criminal, you pull a firearm, you don't know who else around you is armed and will gun you down before you can do harm. And the number of lives saved by legal intervention by an armed citizen was astounding to me. And I was aware of this, and yet I was still astounded by this fact. And that number does not reflect the truth. And I bring this up as an example. If an illegal shooter has a handgun, let's say a high capacity magazine, 16 round magazine, shoots 2 people before he's gunned down by a responsible citizen, you cannot definitively state how many more lives would have been taken if he had not been brought down. You don't know. Missing, wounding somebody, there's no way of quantifying this number. But just that number of illegal firearms users, criminals, were stopped by responsible citizens. That number alone was astounding. You can look this up, by the way. You can do your own research on this. Am I advocating this for Canada? No. But what I am saying is that the lies perpetuated by compliant and purchased media don't reflect the truth. The simplistic viewpoint of liberals and their toadies basically comes out with, guns are bad, you own guns, you are bad. Ain't QED, this extremely simplistic, moralistic, absolutely erroneous viewpoint that they espouse. Another thing I think I've mentioned in the past, the press is very compliant, very much involved and invested in pushing the liberal narrative. most of the press, not all, but most of the media pushes the government liberal narrative about the evils of firearms and firearms ownership. This is all coming from urbanites who have not done good research, have probably never fired a firearm, never owned a firearm, never associated with people who do own firearms, and yet they feel fit to expound and pontificate about firearms and firearms ownership, like that Doctors Against Guns, that ignorant woman. Stick to your lane. Speak about what you know, because all you do, if you start cracking off with bad information, anybody who knows the truth sits there and looks at him and says, "You're a fool. You're speaking through your ass. You don't have any idea what you're talking about." So back to Canada and what this means for Canada. There's been a push. We have the provisions in the law for a concealed carry permit, CCW call, carrying a concealed weapon, CCW. So to get a CCW permit, the provisions are in the law. If you can show cause to to your local police agency, why you should be allowed to carry a firearm on your person, under law, they can, not have to, they can grant you a CCW permit. It is very, 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 very rarely that the applications are put forward because it's almost axiomatic that it's going to be denied. Even where you can show cause, it's going to be denied. I would like to see that change. I really would. But, and this is a big but, and this is going to torque some of my fellow firearms owners. My problem with CCW permits in Canada is very simple. We don't have the necessary training facilities for civilian shooters to be properly trained in urban use of firearms. Okay, now I will explain. Police are trained in what they call shooting through. You have to look, when you're engaging a target, you have to look, consider, if I shoot through that person, where is that bullet going to go? Like if someone is standing in front of a store and you engage them, you shoot at them. If the bullet shoots through, you might hit an innocent bystander, mother and her child, that's happened here in Toronto. These dumbass gangbangers firing shots willy-nilly and killing totally innocent people. So one step that was undertaken by the police is to use expanding ammunition that does devastating trauma to the shooter. And there are several rounds out there. I won't get into the technicalities. There is ammunition out there that dumps all the energy on the target. If you understand what I'm saying, when you hit the target, the bullet does not pass through. It basically fragments and does massive physical trauma. It's almost what they call a one-shot kill. Shoot somebody and they will drop and you will kill them. If someone is an active shooter, I don't have a problem with that. The police the police are carrying man-killer ammunition. Well, yeah. If they're forced to engage a target, don't you think that that's what they should have? What is your problem? Again, don't understand the issues, don't understand the facts. So, Toronto is a population of roughly 3+ million people. I would venture to suggest that if this was a comparable US city in a firearms-friendly state, you would probably have firearms training academies where you could be taught with these simulation programs how to engage a target, how to gauge what they call your backstop, what's behind your target. That's called the backstop. What's in your backstop? If you engage a target, what is in your backstop? Where will that bullet go if you miss or if you shoot through? So they teach them these scenarios. Now we have IDPA, IPSC, the International Practical Shooting Competition. IPSC, a friend of mine made a very good observation about IPSC, IPSC. He says, how do they call it practical shooting competition when the firearms they carry are hardly what you would carry in everyday use? When he trained in Eastern Europe for practical pistol shooting, he trained with a bare bones Makarov pistol, the pistol that he would carry. That's what he trained with, and that's what he practiced with. This is practical pistol shooting. If we had those academies and if the training was there, then I wouldn't have a problem with someone properly trained in one of these academies. There are two things about this. Like I said, one of them is practical pistol shooting, having a proper academy and training. Police are trained to do this. As a military policeman, we were taught to watch your backstop. Soldiers are not trained for this. Soldiers are taught to engage your target. They don't worry about the backstop. Collateral damage is not their concern. Their concern is taking out the enemy. Collateral damage is an accepted tragedy in military engagements, and that is just the hard reality. Innocent people are going to get killed when two militaries clash. Someone is going to get caught in a meat grinder and killed. That is sad, but again, reality. So the other point I would like to make about concealed carry permits in Toronto or in Canada and the training. The other thing that they cannot train you for, and this is what these simulations are meant to do. In hunting circles, it's called buck fever. But what it is, in short, is the adrenaline flow when you finally have a living, a living being in your sights and you are going to pull the trigger. That buck fever, that adrenaline flow affects different people in different ways. Now, when I first started actually hunting, I'd been target shooting for years. For me, it was instinct. And what I found, like for me, that adrenaline rush manifested itself with sharpened hearing, sharpened eyesight. Yeah, my respiration I got face flushed, my respiration got, my heartbeat picked up, my respiration picked up. It's an adrenaline flow. But because I had sharper vision, I was very like laser focused on my target when I pulled the trigger and I dropped the deer. It was, as most of my shots have been, one shot drop. Uh, but I've seen other people shaking, quivering, can't aim the rifle. Their hands are shaking like crazy. They can't aim. I had a friend of mine hunted for years and years, did everything right. Whenever he got a deer in his sights, the shakes, that adrenaline rush screwed him up and he couldn't close the deal. Couldn't nail his game. Finally, the jinx broke, but for years and years, I felt so bad for him because he hunted hard, he hunted well. He's a tremendous hunter, but he just couldn't get over that buck fever. This is what the simulations are meant to teach shooters. How to deal with that adrenaline rush, how to focus it, how to channel it, how to control it so that you can engage your target effectively. A lot of the gangbang shootings, if there were armed citizenry, Eaton's center shooting, prime example, if you'd have had armed citizenry, a lot of the shootings in Canada, a lot of the preventable deaths in Canada would be prevented. And I would like to see responsible trained citizens allowed to carry concealed weapons, especially in high crime areas. Toronto's East End is brutal for gang banging shootings. And the fact is that in an armed society, criminals are much more careful about displaying and using firearms. That's just a fact. That's a provable fact. The statistics and the numbers are all there to verify this. One thing I would like to bring out, I tried to actually get the numbers from the National Firearms Association of the United States. Unfortunately, their data didn't go back that far, but I will bring this up. 2 points I will bring up. One, when Florida, Miami particularly, but Florida relaxed its requirements for firearms ownership. Basically, you had to prove residency, produce a driver's license, and you could get a handgun. This was in response to an unprecedented crime wave when the Cuban boat people came over, because among the good people were thousands of criminals that Castro shipped out of the Cuban prisons. At Pearson International, there were anti-firearms groups literally handing out pamphlets. Don't go to Florida. It's going to be a wild west. There'll be blood in the streets, guns blazing and bullets flying willy-nilly and people dropping like flies. This is what they purported, their narrative, based on no evidence, based on their opinion. What happened? What really happened in Florida? The murder rate plummeted. particularly, and this is one I would really like to address, when I see anti-firearms women, a lot of them expounding against firearms, it is foolishness in the extreme. Because in Florida, and this again, proven rather than theoretical, crimes against women plummeted, purse snatchings plummeted, sexual assaults plummeted. Criminals were afraid to indulge in these things because they didn't know who would be armed and carrying. Deterrent factor. This is something that is not talked about in the press. The deterrent factor of having a responsible armed population. So, something to think about. If I was a woman 5 foot 90 pounds, I wouldn't be afraid of jack shit if I had a loaded 357 Magnum or a 9mm on my hip. With the right ammunition, you'll stop a grizzly with this thing, let alone an attacker. Properly trained citizen is one of the best crime deterrents in the world. Proven, not opinion, proven fact. So, something to consider when you see a press blowing off about firearms. The last point I would like to make, and one of the ones that points out the problems with a biased and compliant media. How many of you have noticed that the media reports someone was killed by a drunken driver, someone was killed by a speeding motorist? And yet, how many people were shot by guns? My response to that is 0. And I will explain. No one has ever been shot that I know of by a gun. No, one incident that I read years ago, and it was anecdotal, so it might not be true. No one has ever been shot by a gun. Ever. People who are shot by other people with a gun. No knife has ever stabbed anybody. People are stabbed by another person with a knife. A person, not a tool. The person with the gun is responsible, not the gun. The person with the knife is responsible, not the knife. This is just basic common sense, but the press pushes this subtle narrative. A gun killed so many people. No. And more people, by the way, are stabbed to death in Canada than are shot. Britain has tried handing here knives. Really? Britain lies, by the way, about their murder stats. People who bring up Britain or Japan or even Australia as examples of gun control or anti-firearms legislation being effective. First off, in Britain, it's not. The press and the authorities actually lie and skew the statistics to try to justify the government's narrative that firearms murders are down. They're not. Japan never did have a problem. Australia, the massive non-compliance and the crime rate in Australia, the crime rate, not so much the murder rate, the crime rate has spiked with the advent of the more restrictive firearms legislation. And you would see that here. The deterrent value of a firearm cannot be overstated. Just possessing one is not only gives the owner a sense of security, but gives the criminals or would-be criminals pause before they commit an act. If there's a possibility they're going to get shot, they will not act. That's just fact. Fact, not fantasy, not feelings, not even a parochial viewpoint or a vested interest, just facts. If you are going to listen to a press, or if you're going to listen to an individual, check the facts. Do your own research. Don't just jump on a narrative. Are we people or sheep that will just jump on a narrative because it suits our beliefs, our feelings? Really? That should not be a criterion for making a decision. So, that's my take on firearms, facts, and fantasy. Have a good morning.